Most High put together. We gon' see. In times.
Serpents lurking, watchers watching, y'all sure I'll stay on point. They lurking. We under the covenant, we ain't got no other choice.
Whenever the topic of slave trade comes up, what comes to our minds are the images of black slaves in shackles and chains aboard a ship bound for the Caribbean and other parts of Europe. This was called the transatlantic slave trade. But that is not what we are talking about today. In this episode, we take a look at the enslavement that was responsible for over 20 million Africans across the Sahara to Egypt, Syria, and other parts of the Middle East. The Trans-Sahara Slave Trade.
In 1842 CE, the British Consul General in Morocco wrote a letter to the Sultan to ask him if he had taken any measures to stop slavery, or at least slave trade. The Sultan replied that he did not do anything about it because it had been the norm since the time of the sons of Adam, and no sects of Islam are against it. Hence, he will not permit anything that the Quran forbids and will not make anything unlawful that the Quran has allowed. In the Sultan's reply, we see the simplest justification, or at least excuse, for almost 1300 years of slavery in the Islamic world.
Sahih al-Bukhari, 7263. Narrated Umar, I went to the house of the Prophet, and behold, Allah's Messenger was staying in a mashraba, and a black slave of Allah's Messenger was at the top of its stairs. I said to him, tell the Prophet that here is Umar bin al-Khattab. Then he admitted me. That when he wanted to emphasize obedience, he told his followers that they had to obey even the worst leader imaginable. We find Muhammad's worst case scenario in Sahih al-Bukhari 7142. Narrated Anas bin Malik, Allah's Messenger said, you should listen to and obey your Imam, even if he was an Ethiopian slave whose head looks like a raisin. Muhammad gives a similar example in Sahih Muslim 3138, where he commands his followers to obey their leader, even if he's a black slave with missing limbs. So the worst possible leader of a community of Muslims, according to Muhammad, would be a black slave. In Provisions of the Afterlife, pages 30 to 31, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya lists 28 of Muhammad's male slaves and 12 of his female slaves. Some of these slaves were black, some were not. Muhammad renamed one of his black slaves Safina, which means ship. He called his slave Ship because he would load up the slave like a ship and make him carry everything. Muhammad apparently thought that black slaves were worth less than Arab slaves, since he once traded 2 of his black slaves for an Arab slave he wanted to set free because the Arab slave had converted to Islam. We know that Muhammad had sex with his female slaves because he eventually got one of them pregnant.
Slavery was already practiced in Arabia and most of the areas that the Muslims conquered in the 7th and 8th centuries. Islam did not abolish slavery, but some regulations were set which were increased upon by the caliphs. There were 4 ways someone could end up a slave. First, a child born to slave parents was a slave. Secondly, someone captured in a jihad against non-Muslims could be made a slave. Third, a slave could be purchased. Or finally, a slave could be given as a tribute. In the Islamic world, various ethnicities were enslaved, not just people of African descent. In fact, they were all considered to have their own advantages. Ibn Batlan, in his handbook, tries to characterize them. He recommends Indians and Nubians as guards of persons or property, as laborers, servants, and eunuchs he recommends Zanj, and as slaves, Turks and Slavs. Yes, even white people could be enslaved. However, there was a distinction between them. The white slaves were called Mamluk, or owned, and the black slaves were called Abd, which means slave. Where white slaves could rise up to respectable positions, the black slaves could not. The Mamluks had their own dynasties in Egypt and India, but the Abd slaves never did. In fact, even in literature or poetry, we hardly find an example of a black man, slave or otherwise, after the Umayyads. Even free Muslim people weren't all treated fairly across the Muslim world, but as always, there were exceptions. An early chronicler, Jashiyari, writes an anecdote about a man called Abdul Hamid, who was apparently the secretary of the last Umayyad caliph. The story goes that the caliph had received a gift of a black slave from a provincial governor. The caliph was unhappy with him and told his secretary to write a letter of gratitude and disparagement. Abdul Hamid wrote, "Had you been able to find a smaller number than 1 and a worse color than black, you would have sent that as a gift." This story, along with many others, show that Arabs didn't view African slaves particularly nicely and preferred other ethnicities if they could get them. Even in the times of Prophet Muhammad, Byzantine and Persian slaves were found in Arabia. Africans were just one of various slaves available. However, over time the number of black slaves grew disproportionately. While it's easy to say that the distinguishing factor between slaves and non-slaves was religion and not race, that's not all that true. The ruler of Bornu, for example, complained in a letter to the Sultan in Egypt about how the slave trades were ravaging Bornu and enslaving free men, even members of the ruler's family and Muslims. While it was forbidden to enslave Muslims, in practice, if you were a black Muslim, you could be enslaved. Very early on, the Muslims signed a treaty with Nubia, where Nubia would provide slaves in exchange for peace. This was probably the reason that Nubia was not taken over by the Muslims for quite a while. However, conquests across the Sahara opened trade routes across the African continent. And among the things transported across the routes were religion, ideas, and unfortunately, slaves. Muslim Arabs bought slaves from these routes all across northern Africa and brought them back into the Islamic heartland. This started almost right after the conquests and the subsequent stabilization of the frontiers. The coast of the Zanj, modern Kenya and Tanzania, was used by the Arabs to bring slaves to Yemen, and from there Oman and the Persian Gulf, and cities like Basra and Baghdad is where they were sold to the Muslims. Somalis, before they were Islamized, were a large number of slaves imported, and later interior peoples were exported as slaves from the Somali coast across into Yemen, and from there via Mecca, Damascus, and Baghdad. In Mesopotamia, a large number of Zanj slaves were used in thousands of plantations and saltpeter mines. Apparently, the working conditions were so terrible that they revolted numerous times between 868 CE and 883 CE and became a serious threat to the Caliphate. This went on for centuries and became a system, but it wasn't as severe as it later grew into. At the time, various African tribes raided each other and enslaved the prisoners, selling them on the frontiers of the Islamic Empire. From here, Arabs took over and took these slaves inland to be sold on the borders, but also in India and across the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, the holiest site in Islamic world, Mecca, became a bustling market for slave trading. People bought slaves in this market when they visited for Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage. Slaves were brought there as a commodity which could be sold to get some cash. They were easier to protect than other precious commodity in a huge caravan, so people brought them along. People also brought them in Mecca since people from all over the world would gather there. All the way up to 1962 CE, slaves were being sold in Mecca. In The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa, John Elambilla Azuma writes the following. The main area from which slaves were drawn and exported to Egypt and other North African Muslim locations and then to the Islamic wider world were the central and western Sudan. The traffic started mainly from Nubia, from which the people living to the south and east of Dongola were taken to Egypt. Slaves were exported also from Kanem Borno via Fezzan to Cairo, Tripoli, and Kairouan. People groups living around the Lake Chad area were later exported along this route. While in the 18th and 19th centuries, Bagirmi slaves, especially eunuchs, formed an important part of the slave traffic along this route. Some were later sent from Tripoli to ports in modern Turkey, Greece, Albania, and southern Yugoslavia, which were all at the time under the Ottoman Empire. Slaves from Middle Niger and the Atlantic coast were also drawn from Gao, Yavargla to Tahret in modern Algeria and Kairouan, and later from Timbuktu through Tuwat to Tlemcen, Sijilmasa, Fez, and other centers of the Muslim Maghreb, from where some passed into Muslim Spain and Sicily when it was under Muslim domination between the 9th and 11th centuries. Ibn Khaldun testifies to the presence of large slave populations in the 14th century North Africa, when he wrote that the blacks constituted the ordinary mass of slaves. Muslim Berber groups of North Africa, like the Tuareg and the Moors, became the chief agents in the raiding and in the traffic of black slaves to North Africa, Spain, Turkey, and the Mediterranean world, some of whom were taken as far as India. As early as the 8th century, the Berber Ibadi community of North Africa virtually controlled the trade routes and thus the traffic in black slaves. Considering the terrible conditions on these routes and the increasingly predatory nature of the slave raids, one historian estimates that for every slave that was sold in the market, 10 had died on the way there. These raids were also labeled jihad by raiders to legitimize them. Neither the Muslim raiders nor the buyers of the slaves really cared about who the slaves were and where they came from. The Swahili coast became a bustling hub of slave trading. A network was established across the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. In the 18th and 19th century, when ivory trade was on the rise, these slaves were also forced to carry ivory and other precious commodities on their ways to the markets by the raiders. It was during those centuries that the slave trade reached its peak. From around 1800 CE to 1850 CE, most European countries abolished slavery, and the slave trade started to die on the western side. However, on the east, it was picking up further. The British did try to have countries abolish it, but it didn't work. Not only did it not work, but it probably had the opposite effect.
Where's the outcry in the amongst black people in the Arab Muslim world when we can see from where we are that there's still slavery going on with black people and Muslim Arabs? Where is the outcry within the actual community, within the black community, within Islam? It's like they don't care about it. It's like they're just used to that being their status, and it's like their pride's gone.
We're shocked to find this woman offering to sell us a child. The young girl seems withdrawn and confused.
Je vais te parler en français. Tu as quel âge? Combien? 16 ans.
شوفي هذا بابا هذا ماما. اسمها عربي لأنها مسلمة.
من غانا ولا من غينيا؟
أنا أنسى من كذا ما غانا غينا مدري شنو.
من وين؟
غينيا.
غينيا. Okay.
About 100 years ago, the British Empire came to this country with their missionaries, and they told the people that Jesus should be believed in as God. Yes, they tried to take your minerals. They tried to take your gold.
The Arab conquest of North Africa, was that a form of colonization?
Absolutely. That the Arab conquest of North Africa was a form of colonization that took place in the 7th century when Arab Muslims burst out of Saudi Arabia and conquered Egypt and went on to conquer the whole of North Africa. There were a lot of Berber tribes there. The Egyptian Copts were the original indigenous of the land, as well as the Berbers. And they were all conquered and Islamized and Arabized. That was also a form of colonization, definitely.
Now, do Muslims today acknowledge this? Are they self-critical about this? Now, do Muslims today acknowledge this? Are they self-critical about this? Now, do Muslims today acknowledge this? Are they self-critical about this? Now, do Muslims today acknowledge this? Are they self-critical about this?
This is from Sahih Muslim 1602, yeah? And I want you guys to read what the chapter's called. It's not chapter 23. It says the permissibility of selling animals for animals of the same kind and of different quality. Yeah, so this chapter is about selling animals, yeah? Mm-hmm. There came a slave and pledged his allegiance to Allah's apostle, which is Muhammad. Mm-hmm. On migration, the Holy Prophet did not know that he was a slave. And then there came his master and demanded him back. Whereupon Allah's apostle said, sell him to me. And he bought him for 2 black slaves. And he did not afterwards take allegiance from anyone until he asked him whether he was a slave or a free man. Now the prophet, mm-hmm. their prophet, mm-hmm. has now bought this other man mm-hmm. for 2 black slaves. So he's got 2 black ones, and this guy's like, okay, take this one. He's like, all right, I'll get 2 black ones. But look at the chapter, bro. Mm-hmm. It's permissibility for selling animals, brother.
So they come
right. Who's the animal?
The 2 black men are.
So yeah, one of our Nigerian brothers that's going to address an issue that's been coming up for a while now. Is when you have a lot of African people going to Arab countries to work, they're suffering. They're suffering a lot in these places, and the brother wanted to just kind of address some of that. Let's go ahead and roll it.
This is the point that you guys need to understand. You can label Africans, you can demonize us. You can deny your own tendency to be evil. You can deny your Arab supremacy because you have it. You can deny all these things and pretend like it doesn't exist, like you're not racist. But the truth is, African lives don't matter in Arab countries, and that is a fact. That's the most inhumane society where any African can live. Go and verify, check online. In some African countries, in Kuwait and some other Arab countries, in Kuwait and some other Arab countries, they publicize merchandising black Africans as slaves. There are applications that you can install on your phone, and through the application, you can buy black Africans as slaves in many Arab countries. Many Arab countries, go and verify. So you can label us criminals, you can say all these things and pretend and deny and fool yourself. You are racist, you are inhumane, there is nothing godly about you.
In his hand, destruction gotta come, that's how he get us out this lane. The devil working hard, trying to get us out his plane. His sheep hear his voice, so he can't get us out his hand. We gon' trust the Son of Man, blow your wings, Father. Your kingdom coming, we just trying to make it in, Father. Rather we